Welcome back, everybody, to a new episode of the New Liar podcast. My name is David Gosselin. I'm your host, and I'm here with our poet friend, Daniel Leach. Welcome, Daniel Leach.
Thank you. Glad to be with you again.
Yes, we're very happy to have you, Dan, and we're very happy to have all our listeners, poets, writers, to join us, because we really do have a lot of fun stuff to look at. We're going to be doing some live readings, and we've been involved in all sorts of fun literary projects. So we're going to have a good time talking about that and just speaking to the overall poetic spirit of the moment, which I think is really alive and well. So you actually, Dan, you gave a presentation recently on Shelley and his Prometheus Unbound, and the theme of Prometheus, especially as treated by Aeschylus. So I actually feel like that's a really, in a sense, that's a really appropriate subject to speak of, given the times we're in. The idea of stealing fire from the gods and actually bringing it to mankind. I feel like there are a lot of budding Promethean fires around, and it feels like poetry is really, it's a great vehicle, right? It's really a powerful force in fostering that, even if it's often, it seems like a very elusive thing. So I felt like that was something worth discussing. Maybe you could say a bit about how you've been thinking about that and what you presented recently.
Yeah, sure. I wouldn't presume to try to recreate the presentation, but I can say a little bit about what prompted me to relook at this subject that I had not really thought much about for many, many years. And it is, as you just said, very much the spirit of the times we're living in that prompted me to think about this again, because, I'm on the negative side, I suppose you could say, we are looking at the potential downfall of human civilization on this planet, either by nuclear war or collapse of the physical economy of many nations, devolution into something like what happened at the end of the Roman Empire. All of these things could very well be the consequence of this, you might say, the playing out of this long arc of history, going back many, many decades, leading to the present circumstances. And we could say more about that, but it prompted me to think once again about what it is that actually does constitute the ideas that are at the basis of everything. I won't say Western Judeo-Christian civilization, because that's very often misconstrued to mean simply a system of values and beliefs, but the more elemental idea that sort of has inspired the culture of the West from the time of the Greeks until the present time. And there's a reason why this myth of Prometheus was so beloved by particularly the Athenians and the culture that flourished at Athens in the 5th century BC, because Prometheus is the Titan, who is a member of the previous race of gods before the Olympian gods, whom the Olympians under Zeus overthrew in order to establish themselves as the ruling gods. Prometheus, however, even though he was a Titan and helped Zeus to overthrow Kronos and the old gods, he disagreed with Zeus, who wanted to wipe out mankind, And I'm not going to attempt to tell the whole story here, but it was this quality of recognizing that there was something special in mankind. You might say a potential that made him, worthy of life, and that made him different than all the other creatures that Prometheus wanted to preserve. And so, long story short, he steals fire from Zeus and gives it to mankind. Now, fire, it's not just literally physical fire, but in this case, fire meant the fire of creative thought, the ability to actually create new ideas in the mind. Prometheus's name, by the way, means forethought or forward thought, the ability to see into the future. In other words, to think over the horizon about what one's actions might result in, and to plan accordingly, to think about the future. No other creature does this. In the myth, Prometheus also gives mankind astronomy, medicine, animal husbandry. I mean, literally every art and science that allowed us to crawl out of the caves and establish civilization is attributed to Prometheus in this myth. Mm-hmm. So he at once is the god that represents human creativity, and civilization, so I became particularly fascinated with not only with the myth, which this was taken up as a matter of artistic theme by many people over the ages. There were Roman poets that wrote poems about Prometheus. He was popular again during the Renaissance, as you might imagine, a period of great, creative outpouring, and then particularly in the so-called Romantic period. There are a number of poets, including Byron and others, who wrote Prometheus poems because he became politically, during the Romantic period, sort of a symbolic figure because of his defiance of arbitrary authority. And right. Zeus represented this arbitrary authority. Zeus and the Olympian gods were the symbol, really, of an oligarchy ruling over mankind. And Prometheus, defies them, and for which he was, by the way, the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say, is that Zeus in anger chains Prometheus to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains because he's a god, he cannot die, so he's doomed to eternal torture, and in the form of an eagle, which is the animal of Zeus, the special animal of Zeus, who goes down, picks his liver, eats his liver out every night, every day, and every night it grows back again, and it just goes on forever. And so he's condemned to eternal torture for the sake of mankind, but will not. But Zeus is trying to get from him the secret of how Zeus will eventually be overthrown. He knows that Prometheus knows something because he can see into the future, and Prometheus will not tell him. In other words, he's willing to suffer eternal torture for thousands of years until the prophecy is fulfilled, rather than give in to Zeus. He's in that sense, sort of a Christ-like figure, only in a pagan context. Yeah. So there were many people who took up this theme, but they always concentrated, as far as I can tell, anyway, particularly during the Romantic period, on this aspect of Prometheus's defiance of the gods. Mm-hmm. And so it took on a politically. This was very attractive to what was emerging back then, and especially after the French Revolution, as sort of a leftist defiance of established authority, of oligarchies and whatnot, of revolution. All right. Now, the positive expression of this was Benjamin Franklin, an actual maker of a real revolution, a good one, was known as the Prometheus of the 18th century, not only for his political work, but for the fact that he discovered principles of electrical currents that ultimately ended up giving mankind almost a degree of freedom from nature and ability to control nature that the original discovery of fire had once done for mankind. So it meant something very real and good as well. But in my mind, no one treated this quite the way that the poet Shelley did in his Prometheus Unbound. Aeschylus, who wrote Prometheus Bound, who lived in the 5th century BC, told the myth as I just related it very succinctly. But he wrote either one or two, depending on who you believe, other plays after Prometheus Bound, which tell the rest of the story. Shelley believed that based on the fragments that he knew of those lost plays or play, that it had Prometheus and Zeus ultimately reconcile. And I suppose everybody lives happily ever after or something. Mm-hmm. Shelley, as he so famously put it in his introduction to his play, Prometheus Unbound, said, "I would not have the oppressor of mankind reconcile with the champion of mankind." So he felt compelled to write his answer to this thing, Prometheus Unbound. And I'll just, all I'll say for now is what Shelley does is have Prometheus ultimately cleanse himself of all anger for Zeus. He actually takes back the curse that he had uttered when he was chained to the rock. And he and his lover, the goddess Asia, essentially on the basis of love, of agape, of a divine love of mankind and of the creative principle that rules the universe that's higher than Zeus, they ultimately are able to bring Zeus down because they wield this higher power. It's not defiance, it's actual love of mankind and love of the creative principle in the universe that they believe mankind uniquely can reflect. So It is a unique treatment of the myth. It's and I've found over the years that very few people in literate circles that I know of that like poetry, that like philosophy, that like drama, have read Prometheus Unbound. Many have tried. They find it a little bit too intense in its almost over the top poetic, inspiration. I mean, Shelley literally let it all hang out in this poem. He used every ounce of poetic, Promethean fire that he had within him to write this thing because he felt it really deserved no less. And at parts people can find it a little bit tedious because it has fauns speaking and echoes from the forests and all kinds of extraneous things that sort of amplify the effect. But at times the poetry in it is so ethereal and soaring as to be almost difficult to sustain, keeping your mind in that place. But I think it speaks to the fact that Shelley considered this his most important work.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of things that we could say at this point, and I think that was a great way to just kind of give people a brief introduction, because, this is one of the richest themes and metaphors that there ever was. And I feel that much of the problem with poetry and, literary circles today, all the different contemporary fads, and people have this idea of poetry as something that is just, it makes you feel intensely. It's aesthetically very pleasing, and it's something that can kind of distract you from the ugliness of the material world, the present world. But when you're looking at these kind of the metaphorical power right? Whether it's poets or prophets, right? They're always using poetry and parable and metaphor to communicate something higher that is not just some quaint or pleasing idea, but it's actually rousing something deep within people that's actually reminding them of what they really are. And in a sense, that's arguably that's really the struggle. It's not to change people or to write on people like they're blank slates and just tell them what they should be believing, or that they should follow this moral code or this ethical system. But it's that it's already there. And the question is, how do you cultivate and awaken that thing which is already there, which is actually the thing that makes you human, as opposed to everything else. And that poetry is actually, it's the thing, it's the vehicle, it's the thing that allows us to explore and develop that. It's the poetic imagination that allows us to actually conduct thought experiments and to explore ideas and to play out different things that maybe in the present moment, it's not possible. But the present moment is always bounded, and the future is not necessarily just a product of the past, of our past experience or what has been. Hence poetry, where we can actually explore what maybe should be, what could be, and how is it different from our current situation. And so, I mean, the metaphor of Prometheus, right? It seems like such a simple thing. Somebody, the Titan stealing the fire from the gods. But I mean, then you compare that, right? You compare even just, a subtle exploration of that theme compared to the very bland, prosaic, left verse right, all these binaries that people get caught in. And I mean, the idea of the struggle between the Promethean spirits and the Zeusians, I feel that's infinitely more insightful and more true than any of the modern left versus right discourse, which is this linguistic model, if you will, right? People are stuck in this linguistic matrix where they have to frame things as this left versus right, and these things belong to that category and these things belong to that category. But then you hear something like stealing fire from the gods, right? The Olympians versus the Prometheans. And you realize that there are Prometheans on both the quote unquote left or right. I mean, there's Prometheans on all sides, and or not all sides, but there are Prometheans on various sides, and there are Zeusians on various sides, and then there's everybody else. And arguably, much of the story of mankind, of politics, is the struggle between the Prometheans and the Zeusians to recruit and organize or manipulate, depending on who you are and your intentions, everybody else that's in between. And so stating it in that way, I think it seems like a simple metaphor, but listen to the, contemporary discourse and then go read Aeschylus, his Prometheus Bound, and you'll probably find that there's infinitely more wisdom, and it's infinitely more useful when you want to think about how to talk to your fellow man than if you rely on these, these talking heads, whether it's Fox News or any of these.
But you've touched on a very important question, which reminds me of a debate that was going on, back in the 1970s. I had a friend who attended the University of Buffalo, and there was a professor there who taught a whole course series on Nietzsche and Wagner.
Okay.
And the struggle between the Apollonian paradigm and not Bacchanalian, but the I'm sorry, it's escaping me right now. The Apollonian and Dionysian paradigm. In other words, one representing strict, formal systems of thought, right, based on the authority of essentially the authority of tradition, and that one violates at the expense of all order, all social order. This could be the conservative church and state, the view of the Holy Roman Empire, Britain in the 18th century. Plug in whatever you want there.
Yeah.
And then the Dionysian being one of total rejection of authority and organized systems of thought in favor of whatever one's feelings are, the expression of one's, individual feelings as opposed to any authority.
Right.
And I remember this is one thing that in the debates we used to have about it, it occurred to me at a certain point when someone introduced me. In fact, it was Lyndon LaRouche, who I became politically associated with back in 1976, that introduced me to this idea of Prometheus, which instantly started to gel in my mind because it answered the paradox of the apparent, eternal struggle between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. There's a third way, which is the Promethean way, which is not rejection of authority on an arbitrary personal basis of feelings. In other words, anarchy. Right? It's rejection of arbitrary authority on behalf of a creative principle that allows mankind to progress. That when you're rebelling in order to do something creative and positive for the future of mankind, that's the Promethean outlook. And that this is what any true political change has to be based on, this kind of idea, or it will, as Shelley was quite, as was Schiller, preoccupied with the thought of what had happened in the French Revolution as opposed to the American Revolution. The French Revolution was a Dionysian revolution. As a matter of fact, we could talk more about it, but the British intelligence agents that were sent into France to make sure that it didn't turn into an American-style Republican movement, but did degenerate into a terrorist bloodbath, actually used all the imagery, with their creation of the sans culotte and whatnot of the Dionysian cults that existed in ancient Greece, which were used by the Greek oligarchs for the same reason, to control the population through their passions, their raw animalistic passions. Oh, so this question of Prometheus has a very strong political message for us today, because if people can, and again, this is not something, because once you try to actually reduce the communication of ideas to an organized system, and I don't want to, be blasphemous against organized religion, because it contains a great deal of truth. But the problem with any organized system, especially when you're talking about in art, when you try to actually preach a doctrine in art, you're immediately killing its capability to inspire in the other person, the listener, the reader, etc., their own God-given creative capability to think, to generate new and profound ideas, which are outside the realm of organized systems. This is why Shelley and Edgar Allan Poe considered the greatest sin in poetry and in art generally to be didacticism. In other words, trying to teach something, directly, through, and literally through poetry. It kills the poetry of it. It has to be inspired within the soul of the other person. I think this, by the way, this speaks directly to the, to put it politely, the poop storm that the recent posting on your website about why Amanda Gorman is not a poet. this speaks directly to that issue, because that's the sin she's committing. It's didacticism, and it's not even good didacticism, by the way.
Right.
It's not even effective preaching.
Right. I mean, you're challenging the gods right now, Dan. I mean, there's a lot we could say right now. I'm sure people, as they hear this, there's all sorts of thoughts running in their head. I'll say what I'm thinking. I mean, first thing, I think I said that before, right? And you're just echoing as well this idea that, rather than these formal systems where you said, the sin of didacticism and trying to teach something to someone versus what I would say is a real classical education where one recognizes that it's already there. And the
exactly.
Great teacher is to prompt that which is already there, right? And to develop to be creative and to develop the kind of pedagogy and metaphors which awaken and prompt these things that are already within people. Because at the end of the day, and I mean, this is what Plato in many of his dialogues, I mean, this is ultimately the meta narrative, right? He's having a dialogue because he's trying to poke and prompt people to discover things and their own higher faculties, which allow them to reason and which allow them to make discoveries in the first place, that they already have to have that potential to make discoveries if the discovery of anything truthful is possible in the first place. Because even if that truth would jump out right at them, unless they already had an idea of that truth inside them, how would they know that that thing that they're looking for, that discovery, is the thing they're looking for? They would already have to have some measure of it within themselves. And so
it's embedded in the very structure, the very substance of a human soul.
Right.
It's one of the ways we know that we actually are a soul.
And in the highest sense, that's what poetry is, right? It's awakening that. And that's why imagery is so important, right? Because we're developing, the poet is creating images, right? They're creating metaphors, which often can take images that seem very familiar, right? They're things that you've heard of. You've heard of fire, right? You've heard of pagan gods. You've heard of the heavens and the sky, but they're brought into new constellations of meaning that suddenly awaken something new within the person. And suddenly they're aware of something that was there all along, but which their conscious attention is now only falling on. And discoveries and education is largely that, and how to develop that. Because if it's not, well, okay, so education is a bunch of rules and you're supposed to learn all the rules so then you can apply it in XYZ situation and know what the truth is. I mean, what about all the things we don't know? How do we know those rules are adequate for dealing with all the things we don't know? So hence we need a method where we can actually recognize new things, recognize ironies, right? Recognize gaps in our thinking. And the poets, right, through irony, through classical irony, we could say, and paradox, just like Socrates or Jesus would always do, using parables and paradoxes and ironies to prompt, right, to create these gaps in people's thinking, which forces them to fill them in with something that can account for this seeming anomaly. And I mean, what's more powerful than that? You don't have to lecture people. You don't have to tell them what to think. Why not just try and see what's already there and see what's already within ourselves and see what's help people see what's already there within themselves. And again, I think this is where we're getting to the real question of poetry, which we talk, I mean, it's the muses, right? what does listening to one's muse really mean? If not that, right? Is it the poet? This is Plato's Ion dialogue, but is it really the poet that's composing, or is the poet simply seeking to find that state of mind, of soul, where they can actually let the poetry flow, right? And the truth and the beauty flow through them without getting in its way. And that much of the art is actually about not getting in the way and knowing.
Well, this touches on a very important principle, which again I think speaks to this controversy that's been stirred up recently, because the assumption that a poet, a good one, makes, or at least I should say good, not a judgment of how skilled they are, but good in terms of what motivates their heart and soul, is one who makes an assumption about his audience, his or her audience, which is that they have this sacred quality within them. All human beings do. That we share something universal. That if you can access in a way that leads them to where you are, to the idea that you want to communicate, if they're honest about their own feelings, that they will be led to it. And that I think that belief about your audience is critical to poetry. If you have contempt for your audience and you think that they have to be lectured, or that you're simply trying to stroke, some other audience of people that you think are going to admire you for saying these wonderful things, whether it's wonderful politically or philosophically or whatever.
Yeah.
You're essentially you're demeaning and showing contempt for people. You're talking down to them. You're assuming that you're not even really allowing yourself to be human. I think that there's a deeply loving and humanistic impulse at the heart of every truly poetic person. We've recently had some very interesting contributions on the Chained Muse website by Caitlyn Johnstone, who's a very interesting poet in that she can be one of the most acerbic, personalities that you can imagine in her political writings, having almost sometimes a sardonic wit. And then you read her poetry, and it has a deep, a very deep love of humanity and a desire to create a better future, right? And a deep feeling for the beautiful that she's assuming her audience has, which I find very, very interesting and refreshing.
Right. And you know what? I mean, the good thing about this thing is it's not scripted, so we can't really go off script here. Therefore, let's throw that poem in right now, since we're talking about it. I mean,
okay.
I'm going to read this because it really is one of the latest poem. I mean, we just published it yesterday. Fingers of Light by Caitlyn Johnstone. I mean, she's an Australian-based poet, and this has a Promethean quality to it for many different reasons. Not even, you can even put the politics aside for a second. If you consider the craft and the originality of what you're about to hear, I mean, it's rivetingly original. Like it's surprising. I just would not have expected to read this, and I am reading it and I'm like, wow, I mean, where did this come from? And at the same time, it really does have a strong political dimension, but it's in no way partisan or polarizing. I mean, because if we're being honest, it's anchored in truth. And I mean, if one disagrees with what it's really saying on a fundamental level, I mean, I'd argue that you're not really on the side of truth. And that's something that that one can figure out. And I mean, that one can even tell somebody like Caitlyn Johnstone has thought about and wrestled with, rather than just tried to, brainwash herself or program herself into XYZ ideology. She's not doing that. So
Okay.
let's just
All right. Go for it.
Fingers of light. Fingers of light peel away the hiddenness of badge-wearing sadists and Apache helicopter war crimes. Fingers of light peel away the lies of dust-faced gargoyles on screens in dark rooms. Fingers of light peel away the dead writings of dead men from healthy brains of living flesh. Fingers of light peel away the gray film of knowing which masks the beauty of seeing everything for the first time. Fingers of light peel away the wallpaper of verbiage overlaying life as it actually is. They emanate from the heart of a turtle in the center of your forehead that is older than the stars. And I rock you gently in my willow tree arms as they peel away the darkness. Heed well the words from my crooked beak, you sky-faced marvel. The outcome of this adventure is engulfed in mystery. The world in which it transpires is swimming in mystery. The world in the eyes with which you behold it are made entirely of mystery. The awareness in which you examine it is the origin of all mystery. We cannot know what the fingers will turn up next. Anything can happen here. Anything. Let your eyes remain as wide as befits this wild ride.
I love the line, fingers of light peel away the gray film of knowing, which masks the beauty of seeing everything for the first time.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Yeah.
That's poetry right there.
It is. It absolutely is. And this reminds me very much of Walt Whitman, of his best, about everything being made of mystery.
Right.
It's no. This is very good. It is very, and it is ultimately, it's addressed to you. I mean, she's literally addressing the reader in a very personal way, to not be a slave to systems or anything, but to listen to their soul, which is connected to that which is the substance of the universe. Very beautiful.
Right. And I mean, that's probably it, right? In the last line, she said, let your eyes remain as wide, right? Let your eyes remain wide. She's not telling you what to think. She's saying, leave them wide open and see what you find. And, I mean, that's what we were just talking about, but I wasn't even thinking about that poem when I said it. But it's funny how that's exactly what she's saying. Her only injunction is really follow what's there and see what you actually can find yourself. And
this goes to, you'll say something and it just triggers a new idea in my mind, but this goes very much to what I believe is the flaw in some of our colleagues on certain websites who champion the cause of classical poetry, classical in form, rhymed and meter, and whatnot, from the standpoint of maintaining tradition, maintaining this beautiful cultural treasure that has been passed on to us, which one can say is a very worthy thing to do. But the problem is, right, that it misses the point, I believe, about what actually constitutes classical poetry, at least in the sense that you and I and our collaborators, that have contributed to the Chain Muse and to the New Lyre, understand it, which is that it's not a question of form, it's a question of intention. That this intention to inspire within other human beings this awareness of their immortal soul, if you will, through the experience of beauty or the sublime, which does it in a much more intense way, because it is not all pleasant. It can be very, it can be very almost agonizing. But this awareness of what actually makes us human, this immortal quality, is the essence, I believe, of all great poetry. That makes it is often expressed in a formal way, because form, particularly what's known as strophic form, where one thing is repeated in the same form, but the idea has shifted to create a paradox, or a juxtaposition, which, as you were saying before, prompts the mind to think, of the idea that is being, prompted, but is not stating in explicit terms. This is why strophic poetry is so good for doing this. But what you just read demonstrates, it does not have to be in a formal thing. It's a question of the intention, where the mind is being led to. And so what a lot of traditionalists in poetry, like some well-known websites that you and I have both contributed to, what they champion is the form, but miss I think this point about what the content is, which is why some of the poems that you read on there are rather trite and shallow, but they're written in perfect form.
Right. And I mean, at the same time, it's an interesting, because in the highest sense, right, the form is actually what makes a lot of those ideas, the contrasts, right, and the ironies clearest. Like when we have a clear sense of, that we're developing a thoroughly composed idea, and there's certain things we want to say. I mean, there's always a contrast of opposites, right? There's always a quality of irony, because it's a dialogue in our own minds. And, in a sense, I think for real poetic composition and inspiration, every time is like the first time. I mean, this is a theme that we'll hear in different places where they'll talk about similar things, right? Where it's supposed to be like the first time for you. And I mean, it feels like Shakespeare. If you look at a lot of his dramas, I mean, many of them are radically different. Like each time he's doing something, it's not like he has a predetermined form for what he's going to do. But what he has our base is a rigorous idea of how to develop a theme. So that sometimes, with like King Lear, all the action starts like right up front. The king is like, well, he's going to separate his entire kingdom, and he's going to do it based on how his daughters make him feel, if like what they say makes him happy or not.
And from the beginning, this is not going to turn out well.
Yeah, he's a fucking baby boomer. Pardon my but like, if you make me feel good and I like you, you're going to get good things, but don't say things that I don't like, because that's going to upset me. And so you're not going to benefit. And there's no idea of like, well, who is the wisest? Like, who actually knows how to run a state? But all that to say that that's front loaded. I mean, that's like, in like business writing, that's like you're front loading. Your email starts with whatever the whole subject, whatever the reason you're writing for, your mom died, right? You wouldn't front load that, right? If you're writing an email, you're not going to say your mom died, and then start talking about the funeral arrangements. You're gonna buffer it with something. In that sense, Shakespeare, because he has a sense of composition, I mean, boom, he just starts with the action right up front, and everything else is just the unfolding of that initial thing. Then if you look at a different drama, I mean, Troilus and Cressida, which is one that I really like, and I'm writing an essay on that, and I think it's a fun example, because he's taking he's taking a Greek theme, right? He's taking a theme from the Iliad, and he's giving it his own treatment, which is very fascinating. So he takes the story of the love story of Troilus and Cressida, and he does his own thing with it, which is just one episode or one theme among many in Homer's Iliads. And Shakespeare takes that and he develops it, and he gives it his own unique treatment, where he's really emphasizing the you have all these fine speeches, which is why I think I like it. I like really nice, riveting speeches, and a good deal of the, the dialogue is the brothers arguing over whether they should keep fighting over Helen or not, right? Like, should we all just keep killing each other over this woman? Like, how important is it? And then everybody makes appeals to why it's good or not. And Hector's kind of in the middle, and he's like, I don't know, this seems like a lot. And finally, though, his brother Paris, and they all prevail, and they're like, look, she's just so beautiful, like, forget it. And Hector goes, fine. And, the war keeps going. But all that but then he has Cassandra, who comes in, and, she talks about the gods, because they're all, right, as we can imagine, everybody's appealing to, well, the gods would say this, or the gods would say that. Sound familiar? And Cassandra comes in and says, well, no, the gods would support what's reasonable. They're not going to want you to do irrational things, right? That's not what heavenly wisdom would elicit from you. And of course the others all prevail, and they're like, they have really nice speeches, which is what's so fun, because their ideas are crazy, but they say them in really, really beautiful and compelling ways. And so that really creates attention for people, because somebody who says something that nice and, who looks that beautiful, like, shouldn't you, it's compelling. And then you have Cassandra, who's like the raving, seeress, who's like, no, this is really a bad idea. And everybody's just like, well, she's crazy. Like, why would you listen to her? All that to say, that's every drama has like a different, you can tell. Hamlet, it's totally different. Macbeth, it's wild. And in Macbeth especially, there's so much. I was listening to, I was watching a version of it, a performance, and it's really creepy. It's really disturbing when you have good actors doing it, and you see like the wife kind of really just sort of convincing her husband, like, you need to do this. And, she's like, unsex me. And like, I'm just, I'm not a, like, get rid of any, assumptions or ideas about what I should be doing as your wife. Like, she really wants the power, and the guy's just there kind of going along, and he's committing these just despicable acts all over, this power lust that he's sort of just being pulled through. And it's just totally disgusting. All that to say that every time Shakespeare's just doing something, wildly new and original, but it's really because he's following his muse. But at the same time, this is all to just get back to what you were saying, Dan, about form, that because he has a sense of composition and he knows how to accent things and to create contrasts and ironies which stand out in the mind, he doesn't need to lecture you, right? And the better understanding of composition and these formal principles that we have, in a sense, the freer we are to do new things and be creative with them, because we're able to create poems and lines and images and in ways that we might not have thought of had we not had developed some rigorous sense of composition, where we see that, okay, there's this theme, I could do this with it, or I could do that with it, and I could do it this way, or I could do it that way. And this is where the form really becomes, these formal elements become useful in illustrating these kind of creative twists and turns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And form, you might say, is the structure upon which one hangs these paradoxes that prompt the mind to go beyond form, and to actually perceive the principle, the idea that is outside of the ability to express in logical deductive terms or in declarative sentences. But yet these ideas are the basis of everything new that occurs to human beings. It first occurs as an idea without the predicates the details, you might say, attached to it. So there's a weird sense about great poetry and great art in general, which is that it's almost like the poet, the creative artist is winking at you and you're winking back that you understand this idea, which lies outside of the expression, the ability to be expressed in words, but yet you were led to through the words. That alone is an irony that's quite delicious.
Right. And I mean, that's really, I mean, there's a lot we could say about that, but I mean, in terms of communication, I mean, if we're talking about like communicating real ideas, and, often people struggle with that, you're trying to get through to somebody for whatever, we're having a discussion about something, whatever the important subject is. And often there's an attempt to want to argue with people. And there's this tit for tat thing, this always happens in politics, or, whatever the, single issue, hot topic, hot button issue is. But when you are faced with a real poet or artist, they don't really do any of that. Actually, they develop their own original paradoxes. And again, parables, right? They tell you a story, right? They come up with something that manages to capture what no amount of words per se really could. And, they develop powerful images, which is why, I mean, imagery is so powerful in modern propaganda, right? It's powerful in politics. And as a result, I think people have also, poetry has gotten a bad rap, or it might be portrayed as somewhat kind of flimsy, or it can be disingenuous, like it's just nice talking, right? You always hear this, that politicians just talk nice. And so poetry is just like this really nice language, but it doesn't really mean anything. And I think there's really been a perversion there, where because language is so powerful and imagery is so powerful, modern propaganda uses the formal outward characteristics of imagery, and it uses language. I mean, I've been writing a lot of stuff about neurolinguistic programming and propaganda and framing techniques and hypnosis. And when you see how this stuff has been so meticulously developed and curated, where, as just one example, which I think is very fascinating, there's this book I was reading by Richard Bandler, who's considered one of the leading hypnotists, and he worked with Gregory Bateson. He was a student of Gregory Bateson, I believe, if I'm not wrong, who, was heavily involved in all the MK Ultra, CIA, brainwashing and mind control experiments. And one thing he said in his book that really stood out is when he said, when you're talking about hypnosis, he said it's sequence, sequence, sequence. I always tell people sequence, sequence, sequence. And I'll explain what that means in a second. But he made the point that hypnosis is really a natural thing, that, or altered states. When you're walking, you're technically in a hypnotic state of sorts. You're in an altered state. You're not thinking about every step you take. There's an automatic system. You're just running that. You're walking. When you're driving, your driving instincts kick in. You're not really thinking about that. So we have all sorts of altered states. And hypnosis is really an organized way of exploring, manipulating, depending on what you're doing. If you're in a therapeutic setting, it's useful, these different altered states. And then you think of imagery, you think of poetry, and you think of the rhetoricians, right? The rhetoric was such a big thing in classical Greece. And Plato, he famously, asked the question, should we ban the poets from our republic? Today, people are, professors, academics, you contemporary literary critics, they're like, yeah, Plato is just, some Kim Jong-un guy who just wants to outlaw poets. Like, it was totally literal. I mean, there's no irony. There's nothing there. There are no illusions. There's no nuance. He just wanted to ban anybody who wasn't saying the right thing. But really what Plato, I think, was getting at, and I think we can appreciate that when we look at modern political discourse and propaganda, especially when we see how far it's gotten with all the behavioral science and the hypnosis and the nudging, is that it's language and imagery is very powerful. And when you, especially when you're praying or trying to manipulate people who have limited linguistic models and ways of thinking, and you start imposing different linguistic maps and images onto them, and they're sort of stuck using that because they don't really have one of their own developed in such a sovereign or, you know, mature way that they can kind of pick and choose what they feel comfortable using. They get locked in these different linguistic matrices and these different, you know, stories, these different sets of imagery that you're giving to them, you know, whether it's Prometheus versus the gods as being a bad thing, where Prometheus is sort of defying the gods and they have to punish him because, you know, he's being bad, and by defying heaven, all sorts of bad things happen. Or, you know, well, who are these authorities? Are these gods good or are they bad? Are they oligarchs? Are they degenerates? Or are they philosopher kings? And in Plato's time, I mean, it was poetry, right? Drama. Like, this is what shaped the imagination of people. And depending on what you were saying and the kind of imagery you were using, which it was understood was very powerful, you could sway people. And so fast forward to, you know, recent times in propaganda, you know, I mentioned sequences, and Bandler was saying sequence. So if you think about the typical politician or rhetorician from ancient Greece who starts a speech by, think of the crying mothers in the street, think of the crying children, right? Think of all those hungry people, right? You open with that image because you want to get people in that heightened state of emotion, which, if you start throwing a few truisms, no one should have to live like that. No one should have to experience this. And then you say, you know, you throw in a couple truisms about justice and freedom, and then you're like, if closing the skies, you know, no fly zones or whatnot, I mean, then we can do our best to make sure that stops. So you've just thrown in a hyper intense image that just gets everybody worked up. You've thrown a few truisms to kind of get people to agree, right? Like, yeah, we all agree people shouldn't be hungry. People shouldn't be scared. People have the right to, you know, say what they want to say. And then, right, only then do you throw in the twist, right? You really put in the poison, because people are in that altered state, right? They've been moved. And so they're open to, we need to do something about this. Like, this is terrible. Things can't keep going like this. And so it becomes very powerful. And I mean, Plato, if we're looking at this question that he asked, the paradox that he's posing to people, you know, he's raising a very serious point about the power of imagery and language. And it seems like, as much as we talk about it today, people don't appreciate how powerful it is. And so they also don't recognize why poetry is so important in the proper hands, so that we can actually get lofty and profound ideas communicated to people of all stripes, right? Like, it's for everybody.
Again, I mean, what you're pointing to, at least in part, in what you just said, is the power of words, because this is what nominalism, which is the ability to call up in people all of the associations, the culturally inculcated associations we all have about certain words, right? So a rhetorician or a politician today may say freedom, right? And we all believe in freedom. We believe in democracy, right? Everybody's talking about freedom and democracy these days.
We're free. We're democratic.
Right. Right. And of course, this has utterly no meaning whatsoever, because there is not freedom, in the Western world. We live in a complete information dictatorship, but they have imbued these words with a certain content which people buy into the general idea, not because they believe in it because they've been convinced in any rational way, because of course it is completely irrational, makes no sense whatsoever, but people believe they have the eyes of their entire peer group, their entire society on them as they're thinking about this. Well, of course, I can't disagree with freedom. I can't disagree with democracy, right? And this is a form of brainwashing, this ability to call up these associations and all of the fears of ostracization that people have about certain ideas, which I think, the only thing that liberates people from this is to develop their ability to actually think outside of the nominalist terms. And again, this gets back to what we're talking about. I mean, I believe, which is what poetry really does, is it allows the mind to actually exist in a universe that's free of nominal, meanings, that's free of systems of thought, that's free of this kind of brainwashing. I think this is what Caitlyn Johnstone is getting at in her poem in a unique kind of way, because when you read a great poem, you realize at the end of it that the idea was there at the beginning, you've arrived at the end, but it was never contained within any one part of it. All of them were the unfolding of some metaphorical idea that led to a higher metaphorical idea, and that there's a one, which is ineffable and undefinable, that existed sort of above and outside of the process of the unfolding, that you're capable of apprehending because you are made of the same stuff as the poet, right? And that is a very pleasurable and wonderful thing to experience. And you realize that any one, part of it is not so important as this overall one. I mean, that's what I believe great classical poems do.
Right. And I mean, it's the opposite of propaganda in the sense that,
it liberates the mind.
The images don't necessarily mean what you assume they mean at first, number one, or they may mean something different than you traditionally associate with XYZ image. But the point is that the overall
in this context,
the overall poem brings all these images together in a unique and new original way, which creates a new irony. It creates a new gap in your thinking that forces a new idea to emerge. And I mean, this is actually the idea of classical metaphor. I mean, if we're thinking about it, I feel like there's a million literary theories. There's so much jargon today. There's so many isms, right? We're talking about nominalism. How about all those isms? Modernism, imagism. I mean, there's so many I'm forgetting now, but I mean, vorticism. Contemporary poetry has a million different isms, but real poetry, you're able to break out of all of that, and to the degree you're not, you get bad poetry, right? You get, that's why there's the article that we published, why Amanda Gorman is not a poet. Not because, there's any ill will or anything. I wish her well. But it's the imagery, everything is so predictable. It's exactly what you thought it would be. You're being lectured on exactly what you expected you'd be lectured on at this, inauguration. And it's, how is it poetry if it's everything that, it's all the platitudes that you would expect at a campaign rally or in like a graduation ceremony. And we're just all supposed to like clap like seals and be like, oh yeah, that's so good. This is how you make people stupid, because they're not actually being challenged to come up with anything in their own mind to that sort of accounts for what they're hearing. They're just they're just jingles. They're just being given jingles, and everybody's just jingling back. Everybody's
perhaps we're giving it too much attention, because it's simply, when you come right down to it, stroking the prejudices of the audience that you're appealing to, not challenging them to think in a new and unique way, which I think,
and I apologize,
real poetry does. In that sense, it's really not. It's not just not poetry; it's the opposite of poetry. I would take it a step further than Adam did.
Right. It's antithetical to poetry, and that's, I apologize, I got sidetracked there. I was talking about metaphor. The opposite of that is metaphor, where you're actually, metaphor means to transfer. If we go back to the ancient Greek, you're taking something beyond. So you have seemingly familiar images, right? You have things that people, it's not like you're talking about something people have never heard of, but you're creating new constellations of meaning. You're generating new ironies, new paradoxes with things that are seemingly familiar, and that's what's getting people to think, and that's where the poetry per se actually lies. It's in that verbal process, that action, that bringing together of different images and transferring the meaning from something seemingly simple as making a fire, or getting fire, or gathering fire, and doing something completely revolutionary with it, right? And it's a very simple idea, but the richness of meaning that can be developed from it, that's where you see, like, okay, this is a real poet, and this is a real idea. Its depth and richness is almost infinite, and in fact, its beauty and its truth only increases with time, because despite us being over 2,000 years past when the stuff was written, it's just as useful and valid today. In fact, it shines new light and new insight onto the problems of our own age, and so that makes it just that much more powerful, that it's still relevant all these years later, and it'll probably be relevant for a hell of a long time going forward. And that's the beauty of a great poetic metaphor, and the ability of people to create new such metaphors and poetical concepts, or to further elaborate and develop them in new original ways. That's where the real beauty lies, I'd say.
Yep. I think it's a very useful discussion for, especially now. And
and I mean, you know what? That's maybe not a bad place to leave it, because you know what? The dialogue's not finished. We want people to participate and join, and we want them to send us their work, right? We want more poets making bold and ambitious moves, and exploring themes and ideas in new ways that hasn't been done before. And the more we can see of that, I think the more inspiring it's going to be for people generally, especially when you're actually writing something that people want to read, right? That's not just for some niche, a literary circle in some creative writing department at a university where everybody thinks the same thing and everybody's just pretty much writing about themselves. It's like creative nonfiction, but it's all just, there's not many ideas. So when there's real ideas and people are actually excited about exploring ideas and exploring their mind and letting their imaginations sort of wander a bit, so that they can find new insights, people want to hear that. They don't need to have read a bunch of books. They don't need to know classical Greek, though. I mean, it's always good, but they don't need to know all these things to appreciate a work of great beauty, in the same way that you don't need to know everything about harmonics and scales to appreciate a great symphony by Mozart. And in that sense, it's exciting, because whoever you're writing for, they don't need to know all these things. If you can write something truly beautiful, and gripping and compelling, people are going to want to read it, and they're going to be excited, and we're all going to be excited because it means that mankind is still creative, and despite all the propaganda and the information wars, people aren't afraid to be creative. And
Yeah,
I think
that's very true, and that's why it's so heartening to see that there is a great upsurge of creative young people again, almost as a reaction to the cultural wasteland we've been living in for the last 50 years. I think we're on the cusp of something very, very great, a real renaissance, and that we have a role to play in helping to inspire it.
Absolutely. So now there's only one question. We're gonna close everything out with a poem here. Now the only question is, do I read it or do you read it? I have your poem Stones in front of me, and I think it'd be a great way to send everybody off.
I could.
You want to read it, or just should I?
I could do it, I guess. Yeah. It's on the
Page 27 of our New Lyre magazine, which everybody should get.
Okay.
Check out the description for details.
Okay, hold on. 27. It's after the devil at Woodstock. Yes, here we go. Okay, Stones. These stones that like huge sculpted figures lie amid the trunks of moss and fern-clad trees. Eons of creatures have seen born and die, and the land's face carved by the shifting seas. All of Earth's seasons since the dawn of man are but a day in their old being span. But of the self-same cosmic dust as I, they seem to whisper low upon the breeze. I listen to that murmur, drawing near and touch the old moss-bearded face of one whose sacred language only those may hear who have imagined a world just begun, and their own atoms scattered in this earth, awaiting over ages for their birth into a form that would someday appear and know the meaning of what time had done. And I hear all the voices in those stones of all the souls who breathed into the air their lofty thoughts, their dreams, their passions' moans, the pain and joy, the hope and the despair, and feel that my soul's sound may penetrate into their depths and someday resonate like scarcely heard, but felt, low murmured tones that seem to call us as from a dream somewhere.
Beautiful. Beautiful. On that note, I thank everybody for listening. I thank you, Daniel Leach, for joining us.
Thank you.
And we'll be back again soon.
Okay.
Thank
Sounds
you.
good.
Good night.
Good night.